there comes a quiet, piercing moment in life, a moment where you stop waiting for the world to understand you. It's not dramatic. There's no stage, no applause, no audience. Just silence, the kind that seeps into your bones when you realise no one is coming to fix things for you. No one is lying awake at night thinking about your pain. And yet in that silence, something ancient awakens. A strength that doesn't beg, doesn't explain, and doesn't need to be seen. That is the moment you stop performing, and you start becoming. Because yes, the world may be indifferent, but you don't have to be powerless. The Stoics understood this thousands of years ago. They taught us that true power begins the moment our expectations die. And in that death, real life begins. Think about it. How often do we chase after validation, hoping someone will notice our struggle, praise our resilience, or give us the comfort we crave? Many of us live with this quiet fantasy: if I hurt enough, someone will see it. If I explain it the right way, someone will finally understand. But life rarely plays along. Pain gets ignored. Tears go unseen. The phone doesn't ring. Not because people are cruel, but because they're drowning in their own storms. Everyone carries battles you'll never witness, just as they'll never fully see yours. If you build your identity on being noticed, you'll spend a lifetime feeling invisible. That ache of being overlooked. It's not cruelty, it's reality. And if you let it, that reality can become your greatest teacher. When we're young, we believe suffering deserves recognition. We imagine that enduring pain earns us comfort, as though life will hand out medals for survival. But the truth: life doesn't send angels when you fall to your knees. It simply moves forward. Friends forget, strangers scroll, and the world spins on. It sounds harsh, but harsh doesn't mean untrue. And here's the paradox: that painful realization is the first step toward freedom. Because once you stop expecting the world to respond to your pain, you stop waiting. You stop freezing your life in hopes that someone will notice. And finally you begin to move, not for applause, not for sympathy, but for yourself. Carl Jung once said, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you don't know, the world will tell you." But here's what he didn't say: most people don't ask because they care. They ask so they can fit you into a box or category that makes sense to them. They don't see you, they see their idea of you. And the moment you stop performing for their gaze, you start living for something real. Yes, there's a sorrow in realizing you are not the main character in anyone's story but your own. But that's not rejection, that's simply gravity. No one owes you understanding. No one is required to hold your hand through the fog. And while that truth can make the world feel colder, it also sets your inner world on fire. Because now you are the one holding the torch. You are the one lighting the way forward. This is where freedom begins. There comes a turning point when you stop waiting for someone to read between the lines of your silence. You stop hoping that your quiet breakdown will be noticed and gently fixed by someone who just happens to understand. Because now you understand, and that changes everything. The sting of disappointment slowly transforms into clarity, and clarity, as the Stoics taught, is the first real freedom. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself each day: do not waste what remains of your life in speculating about your neighbours. In other words, stop hoping someone else will see your wounds and assign value to your existence. The more you focus on being seen, the less you truly see yourself. And ironically, the more invisible you become. You fade into noise in someone else's life instead of becoming the clear signal in your own. But when you finally let go of the hope that others will witness your suffering and give it meaning, that's when you begin to build something indestructible. Not because you've hardened, but because you've become clearer. You start noticing how much of your identity was built around being seen, around the belief that surely someone should care. And when they didn't, you took it personally. Yet here's the truth: just because people don't care doesn't mean you're unworthy. It means they are human, flawed, distracted, overwhelmed, just like you. The game was never about being seen. It was about realizing you've been the witness all along. You are the one who has carried the full weight of your thoughts, your struggles, your victories. That isn't a curse, it's a gift, because it means the power to change your story was never in their hands. It was always in yours. There is immense power in being unseen. There is clarity in walking without an audience. Epictetus once said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." And that's exactly what happens when you stop hoping to be noticed. You begin becoming not for attention, not for applause, but because something deep inside you refuses to stay small. The pain that once felt unbearable begins to take shape as your blueprint. The silence that once haunted you becomes your teacher. The solitude that once frightened you becomes your home. And when that shift takes place, you no longer need to broadcast your wounds. You carry them differently, not as a burden, but as proof that you survived, that you kept moving. So maybe being overlooked was never the tragedy you thought it was. Maybe it was the beginning, the slow, quiet death of illusion, and the birth of something real, something solid, something that no longer seeks validation because it is too busy building what will last. You don't need to be seen to become something great. You need to see yourself clearly, honestly, without decoration. That's where everything changes. That's where real life begins. Because when no one listens, something unexpected happens. You finally start listening to yourself. Not the surface voice, the one echoing with expectations, but the quieter voice underneath. The one that's always been there waiting for you to hear it. And in the absence of applause, that voice becomes your guide. Silence has a way of growing roots. At first it feels strange, even uncomfortable. You're used to checking your reflection in the eyes of others, waiting to see who you are based on how they respond. But when those eyes turn away, something remarkable happens. You learn to see yourself from the inside, and in that moment everything begins to shift. You move differently, not because someone told you to, not because someone believed in you, but because you chose to show up without witnesses, without cheerleaders, without anyone holding the door open. Self-reliance doesn't arrive in a burst of confidence. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives slowly, often disguised as loneliness. One day you wake up and realize no one is checking in, no one is asking how you're doing. And instead of falling apart, you begin to build. You begin taking yourself seriously, not because others do, but because you've grown tired of waiting. Think about it. How many times have you paused your own growth waiting for someone to give you permission? Waiting for someone to say, yes, this is the right time, the right step, the right direction. But what if that permission never comes? What if no one ever tells you that you're ready? Would you stay frozen forever? Or would you finally claim the authority that has always been yours? That's where real power begins. Not in being chosen, but in choosing yourself. The world trains us to crave validation as if it were oxygen. But the Stoics knew the truth. Peace doesn't come from popularity, it comes from discipline. Epictetus once said, "No person is free who is not master of themselves." Freedom isn't found in constant support, it's found in the quiet knowing that even when no one is there, you will continue. Even when the room is empty, you'll still do the work. And not out of bitterness, but because the work matters. Because you matter. When you understand that showing up stops being a performance, it becomes an act of self-respect. And in that quiet shift, a new relationship forms not with the world, but with your own mind. You begin to trust yourself more. You start asking what your body and soul need. You notice the fatigue, the pull in your gut, the fire in your chest. You stop outsourcing your intuition. You stop living reactively. Carl Jung once wrote, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." An awakening doesn't come with dramatic explosions of insight. It feels like small, consistent choices that build a foundation under your feet. You start keeping promises to yourself. You take that walk. You write those words. You say no when something drains you. These acts are quiet, almost invisible from the outside, but they build the strongest currency of all trust in yourself. And trust in yourself is the foundation of freedom. There's a quiet strength that grows when you realize you are your own backup plan. When silence no longer scares you. When you don't need to announce every move, explain every feeling, or beg someone to notice your effort. Because you already know. You know the storms you've endured. You know what it took to still be standing, choosing growth instead of collapse. That isn't arrogance, that's integrity. You are no longer performing for the world, you are becoming for yourself. Yes, there will still be moments of doubt. Moments when you wish someone would simply say, "I see you." But the difference now is you don't depend on it. You no longer fall apart in its absence. You carry yourself with the quiet awareness that you've earned your own respect, and that in today's world is rare. Seneca once wrote, "The greatest empire is to rule oneself." And ruling yourself doesn't mean perfection. It means consistency even when no one notices. It means doing what matters even when the applause never comes. It means holding your standards high even when no one is watching. That is true sovereignty. That is what it means to build a life that cannot be shaken. When you build your life from within, you're no longer dependent on external structures, you become the structure. You don't collapse when someone pulls away. You don't unravel when you're misunderstood, because your foundation was never built on their approval in the first place. It was built on clarity, on quiet choices made in solitude, on the strength of waking up each day and moving forward again and again. That's who you've chosen to become. And here's the most powerful part: once you begin to rely on yourself in this way, you stop resenting others for not being who you needed them to be. You release them. You stop waiting for them to return to notice, to explain. You no longer tie your progress to their presence. You keep moving regardless. Not with coldness, but with grace. This is freedom. Not because the pain is gone, but because the pain no longer defines your path. You carry it, but it doesn't carry you. That is true self-reliance, not the absence of need, but a deep inner steadiness that says, even if no one sees me, even if no one comes, even if no one helps, I will keep going, because this life is mine to live, and I will not wait for anyone to give me permission to become who I was always meant to be. Yet we live in a world that rewards exposure. Every feeling must be shared, every wound displayed, every struggle turned into content for others to comment on. The more visibly broken you are, the more attention you receive. But not all attention heals. Some of it is hollow. Some of it keeps you dependent on being seen as wounded just to feel connected. Without realizing it, you start to perform your pain. You edit your suffering. You package it for sympathy. What was once sacred becomes consumed. What was once your private inner world becomes a storyline for others to follow and then forget. There's a vital difference between honesty and emotional performance. One comes from depth, the other from habit. One is quiet, the other rehearsed. Yet most of us were never taught the difference. We confuse expression with healing. We think that if we talk about a wound, we've worked through it. But sometimes the more you speak of a wound, the more alive it stays. Not everything needs to be narrated. Some things must be felt, endured, and integrated in silence. The Stoics weren't emotionless, they were composed. They believed in feeling deeply, but not allowing those feelings to control the direction of their lives. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, wrote, "Be like the cliff against which the waves continually break, but it stands firm and tames the fury of the water around it." He didn't mean suppress emotion. He meant don't turn it into a performance. Let it become presence. We've been conditioned to believe silence is weakness, that if we don't express every feeling, we're hiding. But some things aren't meant to be shared. Some parts of your story are sacred precisely because they belong only to you. Keeping something private doesn't mean you're ashamed. It means you're protecting something precious, and that unnerves people. Because silence can't be dissected, it can't be pitied or praised. It demands space, it creates mystery. And in that mystery your strength quietly grows. In a world addicted to constant access, mystery feels threatening. But mystery also holds power. Carl Jung often spoke of the shadow, the hidden parts of ourselves we bury or project. Yet he also said solitude is for me a fount of healing which makes my life worth living. The truth is not every form of healing needs to be visible. Some of the deepest transformations happen in silence when no one is watching. They happen when you sit with your thoughts, when you choose not to respond, not to prove, not to explain, when you allow emotions to move through you without needing them to be validated. That's not suppression, that's sovereignty. We've been taught to believe that loudness equals strength. But strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's steady. Sometimes it has no interest in being understood. You don't need to prove your growth. You don't need to narrate your healing in real time. You can let the results speak for you later. And that patience, this refusal to perform, is where your power lives. Because it means your peace is no longer up for public negotiation. There's a rare beauty in becoming unexplainable. There's strength in being the kind of person who doesn't share every emotional bruise just to receive softness in return. Not everyone deserves access to your struggle. That's not hiding, it's maturity. It's choosing to stop offering your pain as currency to buy connection. When you stop broadcasting your wounds, you stop attracting those who come only to witness the damage. Instead, you start drawing people who respect what you've quietly built. Seneca once wrote, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." But once you've faced adversity and grown from it, you don't need to display the scars to justify your strength. You don't need to keep reopening wounds to remind others what you've endured. You've already proven it to yourself, and that's enough. The moment you realize your emotions are not currency for attention, you stop spending them so recklessly. You begin guarding your inner life like something rare because it is, and in that guarding clarity emerges. You feel how much energy was wasted explaining what didn't need explanation. You see how much power was lost in asking for understanding from people who lack the depth to understand themselves. Yes, the crowd celebrates vulnerability, but often forgets the truth. Real vulnerability isn't exposure, it's discernment. It's knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. It's choosing who gets to see the real you and who only gets the surface. You don't need the world to validate your emotions for them to matter. You don't need to turn your pain into art just to prove why it hurts. You can hold your pain quietly. You can heal without display. You can grieve without an audience. And when you do, something powerful happens. You stop fearing silence. You begin to feel at home in it. Silence no longer feels like abandonment. It feels like a return to yourself, a return to what's real. There is nothing wrong with expressing emotions, but when expression becomes performance, it robs you of your strength. Sovereignty begins the moment you choose presence over performance, the moment you stop explaining yourself just to feel safe, the moment you understand that your peace is not fragile, it's forged in solitude, and when others can no longer predict you by your emotional patterns, they start to realize what you've built a strength that doesn't need an audience to exist. There's a moment when people start to respect you not because you became colder, but because you became wiser. You no longer owe anyone a front row seat to your healing. You don't need to bleed in public to prove that you're human. Some things are meant to be held close. Some truths are meant to be whispered only to yourself. That's not hiding, it's maturity. And in a world that glorifies noise, this kind of quiet becomes its own rebellion, its own freedom. Rejection often feels personal because it touches something primal in us, the need to belong, to be seen, to be accepted. But what feels like rejection is often redirection. You weren't dismissed because you lack value. You were set aside because your depth couldn't be digested by shallow eyes. Your silence may have been mistaken for absence, your self-containment for coldness, your boundaries for indifference. But the truth is, you were misunderstood, not because you failed to express, but because you carry a frequency most people aren't tuned to. That doesn't make you wrong. It makes you rare. The world rarely celebrates nuance. It favours what's easy to label, easy to consume, easy to predict. And when you don't fit into those neat little boxes, you become inconvenient. And in a world obsessed with categorizing, inconvenience is often discarded before it's even explored. It's easy to internalize that as a flaw, to think, if only I were louder, if only I smiled more, if only I softened my edges, maybe then I'd be accepted. But that is the trap, the belief that your value lies in being easy to digest for others. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who others can easily understand, not who fits the mold, but who you are when no one is watching, when you've stopped chasing approval." That kind of authenticity isn't always comfortable. It often invites misunderstanding. It requires solitude, but it also creates space for a deeper kind of transformation, one that isn't driven by applause but by alignment. Eventually you stop interpreting rejection as loss. You begin to see it as clarity. Every person who overlooks you, every space that doesn't welcome you, every silence that follows your presence, it all reveals something. Not about your worth, but about where your energy doesn't belong. And that insight is priceless. It saves you years of self-doubt. It teaches you to invest only where you're valued, not where you're merely tolerated. Once you learn this, you stop chasing explanations. You stop asking why someone didn't choose you. You realize that not being chosen was never a curse, it was a blessing, because it gave you back to yourself, and from that place a quiet revolution begins. You redirect all the energy you once spent on being understood into building something real, something that doesn't need to be explained, something that stands on its own, a body of work, a lifestyle, a discipline. This is the shift from emotional scarcity, where you constantly fight to prove your worth, to psychological sovereignty, where your existence is no longer up for debate. That's when your center of gravity moves inward. You're no longer shaken by approval or dismissal. You become grounded. And grounded people are magnetic, not because they demand attention, but because they carry something rare: stability in a world that spins too fast. People will misread you. They'll invent stories to make sense of your quiet, your ambition, your boundaries. Let them. You're not responsible for correcting every false narrative. Marcus Aurelius once said, "The opinion of 10,000 men is of no value if none of them know anything about the subject, and you are the subject." Most people don't really know you. They see fragments, projections, assumptions. What used to bother you now becomes background noise. And the moment you stop trying to correct the noise, your focus sharpens. You sleep deeper. You move cleaner. Because your life is no longer built on being perceived correctly, it's built on being lived truthfully. That shift brings peace. You stop wasting energy explaining your priorities, your silence, your choices. You don't justify why you stepped away. You don't decode your boundaries. You simply live them, not as a defense, but as an act of self-respect. And in time, you become someone who moves with conviction, not commentary. That creates distance, not from people, but from the noise that once clouded your mind. Rejection becomes revelation. It doesn't shrink you, it sculpts you. It shows you where not to go, who not to become, what not to settle for. Every closed door clarifies direction. Every silence refines your voice. Every betrayal deepens your discernment. What once felt like exile now feels like space. Space to breathe. Space to build. Space to become not someone acceptable, but someone undeniable. This is the movement from wanting to be seen to choosing to become. You stop speaking just to be heard and start speaking to build. You stop entering rooms to prove your worth and begin walking in already knowing it. You stop asking if you're too much, too quiet, too intense, and instead you ask if the space is too small for your truth. You stop apologizing for your depth and start protecting it. That's not arrogance, that's arrival. So if you've been overlooked, let it be your initiation. If you've been misunderstood, let it be your turning point. You are not here to explain yourself into someone's comfort. You are here to become someone whose very presence rewrites the room. That begins when you finally see rejection not as the end of your worth, but as the beginning of your clarity. People talk about loneliness as if it's something to escape, as if the absence of others means the absence of value. But solitude, when chosen with intention, is not isolation. It is transformation. It doesn't shrink you. It burns away everything that doesn't belong. At first it feels heavy and echoing silence where the world's noise fades and only your own thoughts remain. But slowly that silence sharpens. It becomes a mirror that doesn't lie. And in that mirror you see not weakness but foundation. Solitude doesn't destroy you. It reveals what was always there beneath the noise, the craving for approval, the impulse to please, the subtle performances you didn't even realize you were giving. And when those melt away, something stronger emerges. Something real. In that stillness you finally meet yourself, not the curated version, not the identity shaped by expectation, but the raw material of your values, your fears, your truth. And that is why solitude feels terrifying for so many. Because when there is no one left to impress, no one left to chase, you are finally left with the truth. No edits, no performance, just you. And while that might feel like loss at first, it is actually the beginning of freedom. Epictetus reminded us, it's not things that disturb us, but our judgment of them. And in the silence of solitude, those judgments fall away, leaving space for something unshakable to take root. In solitude, your judgments rise to the surface. You begin to see clearly how many of your thoughts aren't even your own. How many of your fears carry the echo of someone else's voice. How much of your identity was built not on pursuing truth, but on avoiding rejection. And it's here in this raw awareness that the internal alchemy begins. The discomfort doesn't vanish, it transforms. What once felt like loneliness becomes privacy. What once felt like exile begins to feel like clarity. Slowly your own voice grows louder than the world's opinions. And that voice, uncensored, unpolished, unafraid, becomes your teacher. You realize peace isn't found in a crowded schedule or a crowded room. Peace is presence. It's the ability to sit with yourself without flinching, to feel the full weight of your own mind and not run away. That's not detachment, that's mastery. Carl Jung wrote, "The man who looks outside dreams. The man who looks inside awakens." Solitude is what forces you inward, what wakes you up. And with that awakening comes responsibility. You can no longer blame the noise for your confusion. You can't blame others for your stagnation. It's just you now. And that's where true power begins. The moment you stop externalizing your life, you reclaim the authority to direct it. You're no longer waiting for someone to save you, validate you, or guide you. You start building your compass from within. And that compass doesn't point toward attention, it points toward integrity. Most people avoid solitude because they dislike what they feel when everything else is stripped away. But that discomfort is the work itself. That's the medicine. You don't become strong by avoiding yourself. You become strong by confronting what's unhealed, unclear, and uncertain, and doing it without an audience. That's the difference between isolation and solitude. Isolation is running away. Solitude is running deeper. And in that deeper place, resilience is formed not loudly, but quietly, consistently, without applause. You begin making decisions from a different place. Not from will this be accepted, but from does this align? You trust your instincts more because you've spent time with them. You've listened long enough to tell the difference between intuition and insecurity. And that kind of self-knowledge can't be given, it must be earned. Earned through silence, through space, through stillness. This kind of clarity doesn't shout. It doesn't announce itself, but others feel it in the way you speak, in the way you move, in the way you no longer chase what once pulled you apart. Solitude sharpens your boundaries. You stop saying yes just to avoid disappointing others. You stop engaging in conversations that drain your spirit. You learn that no is not unkind, it's honest. And honesty cultivated in solitude becomes a way of life. You don't need to prove anything anymore. You don't need to justify your distance or explain your focus. You simply live it, because you've done the work in silence and now your energy speaks louder than words. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." Solitude shows you the difference. It frees you from imagined disasters, false narratives, and inherited fears. It grounds you in what's real. And in that soil, something unshakable begins to grow, a sense of self that doesn't bend with trends, doesn't shift with noise, and doesn't break under the weight of being unseen. A strength that does not wobble when misunderstood, a direction that doesn't collapse under doubt. That's what solitude builds. When you return to the world after time alone, you come back different, not distant but deliberate, not bitter but boundaried. You don't speak just to be heard, you speak from stillness, not from noise. You're not easily swayed, not easily shaken, because you know the ground you stand on. You built it yourself, one quiet moment at a time. Solitude isn't punishment, it's preparation. It's the training ground for self-trust, for self-respect, for self-direction. It isn't where life ends, it's where life begins to deepen. And the person who has walked through their own mind, awake and unafraid, becomes someone the world cannot easily move. Because they no longer belong to the noise, they belong to themselves. There comes a quiet turning point in every life when the version of you that once felt essential begins to fall away. Not with a dramatic crash, but with a slow erosion. The old self, the one who bent to fit into spaces too small, who rehearsed words just to be liked, who depended on constant approval, starts to feel heavy, outdated, false. You try to carry it a little longer out of habit, out of fear, even out of guilt, but it stiffens, it drags, and eventually it begins to rot. That's not failure, that's evolution. When something dies within you, it isn't always loss. Sometimes it's the first breath of something more real, the beginning of a more honest existence. At first it feels disorienting. You don't feel quite like yourself, but you also know you can't go back. The mask no longer fits. The old patterns feel exhausting. You say less, but every word carries more weight. You stop explaining not because you have nothing to say, but because you no longer need everyone to understand. The chase for approval fades, and in its place, something steady takes root. You move with more intent. You don't feel silence out of nervousness. You don't perform your personality to make others comfortable. You stand like a mountain, still grounded, unmoved. And it's strange how people react when this shift happens. Some distance themselves, others question what changed. They'll say you seem colder, more distant, less fun. What they're really sensing is that you've stopped making yourself endlessly available for emotional labor you never consented to. You've stepped out of the cycle of constant reassurance. You're no longer addicted to being liked. And that unsettles people, because when someone who used to conform suddenly stops, it feels unpredictable. And unpredictability is threatening to those who are still clinging to the old version of you. But here's the truth, they don't see that version of you needed to go. It had to fall away so you could finally move freely, so you could stop editing your truth to fit someone else's narrative. Carl Jung once wrote, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." You didn't shed your old self out of hatred. You outgrew it out of truth. You stopped condemning your need for space, your craving for solitude, your hunger for a simpler, quieter strength. And in that acceptance, the old self was released not as punishment, but as a rite of passage, a natural evolution into who you were always meant to be. And you don't need to explain this process to anyone. The transformation itself speaks louder than words. The people who truly understand you won't ask for explanations. And those who don't, they were never meant to walk with this next version of you. You begin to notice who respects your silence and who only knew you for your noise. You see who valued your essence and who only loved your accessibility. That clarity stings, but it's necessary. It separates the seasonal from the lifelong, clears out the emotional clutter you were too polite to discard, and creates space for real alignment. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." And that's what the disappearance of your old self truly is. It feels like a loss, but in reality it opens a new path. A path where you no longer chase connection. You attract it by being grounded. A path where you don't need to be known by many, because you are finally known within yourself. You stop seeking mirrors in others. You found your own reflection, and it's enough. There's something sacred about becoming someone who no longer needs to announce their change. You don't post about it. You don't campaign for recognition. You simply live differently. And that difference becomes impossible to ignore. People feel it in your energy, in your decisions, in your refusal to be pulled into petty dramas. They sense a calmness in you that can't be faked because it was earned in the dismantling of your old self, in the nights of doubt, where you still chose to continue, in the moments you wanted to explain, but chose instead to evolve. You're no longer triggered by the same things. You're no longer drawn to the same conversations. You no longer feel the pull to be constantly available. At first it feels like loneliness, but then it transforms into something else, freedom. Because you realize you were never truly connected to those people, those roles, those places. You were only connected to the version of yourself you had to become to survive there. And now that version is gone. Seneca said every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. This isn't just a shift in mindset, it's a rebirth. And like all rebirths, it begins quietly, uncelebrated, unnoticed, but profoundly real. And with time it becomes undeniable, not because you announce it, but because you embody it. You become someone who moves with quiet authority, someone who doesn't need to explain their values because they live them, someone whose absence speaks just as loudly as their presence once did, not from pride but from peace. The old self was necessary. It carried the lessons, the wounds, the struggles for belonging. But its time is over. You owe it nothing except gratitude and release. And now in its place you stand clearer, stronger, unapologetically whole. You no longer look back in search of validation. You no longer reach forward in desperation. You are grounded here and now. And that more than anything is what makes you impossible to categorize. Because you've stopped being who the world told you to be. You've become who you were always meant to be. True presence doesn't come from how much you say or how loudly you say it. It comes from how little you need to. There is a quiet weight in someone who has stopped seeking validation, a power in their stillness. You feel it when they walk into a room, not because they try to control the space, but because they don't need to. They don't announce their presence. Their energy carries it for them. They don't push to be noticed, yet somehow they're the one people watch. It's not arrogance, it's not performance. It's the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needs permission to exist in a world obsessed with appearances. That kind of restraint is rare, and because it's rare, it's magnetic. You begin to see that real strength is quiet, not hidden but uninterested in performance. It belongs to those who have faced their fear and sat with it, who have walked through pain without turning it into a show, who no longer need to posture or puff up. They've already looked into the abyss and returned without the compulsion to prove anything. Carl Jung once said, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." And when you've done that kind of internal work, everything about you changes. The way you move, the way you speak, or how often you choose not to. Silence itself becomes a statement. You stop reacting to every opinion. You stop defending every move. You let go of the compulsion to explain yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. This isn't apathy, it's alignment. You understand that if someone doesn't see your value, no amount of words will make them. And if they do, you won't need to convince them. So you conserve your energy. You speak only when it matters. And when you do, people listen. Not because you're louder, but because your words are chosen. They weren't scattered, they were earned. They weren't about being heard, they were about carrying truth. There's a rare power in that kind of detachment. Not the cold kind that pushes people away, but the steady kind that doesn't cling to outcomes. When you no longer rely on others to affirm your worth, you free them from carrying your identity, and you free yourself from the constant pull of needing to be liked, validated, or praised. That freedom makes you light, but it also makes you heavy in the eyes of others. Your self-possession becomes something they can feel, and it unsettles those who are still measuring themselves through the eyes of others. Because when they meet someone who doesn't need the crowd, they're forced to face the truth that they might still be living for it. Marcus Aurelius said, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be. Be one." That is the essence of commanding without words. You don't try to be impressive, you just embody your values. And the irony is, when you stop trying to impress, you often become unforgettable. Not because you shouted, but because your silence had depth. Because your stillness had direction. Because you weren't trying to win the room, you were rooted in something far deeper than performance. People often mistake detachment for disinterest, but true detachment is the highest form of clarity. It means you can engage without being consumed. You can be present without being performative. You can care deeply without clinging tightly. And that clarity speaks louder than charisma. Because when someone cannot be shaken by judgment, cannot be baited into overreacting, cannot be swayed by flattery or criticism, they start to feel like an immovable force. And forces aren't just respected, they change the space around them. They make the world adjust. This is what separates the grounded from the attention hungry. The grounded don't compete for the spotlight because they carry their own light. They aren't chasing compliments or performance-based connections. They're building something quieter but lasting. Something that doesn't crumble when the room goes silent. Something that doesn't bend with public opinion. And people notice. They always do. Because in a culture that rewards the loud, the steady become mysterious. The ones who don't try to prove themselves begin to feel as if they've already proven something far greater: self-mastery. There's no need to chase recognition when you move with intention. No need to explain your pace when you trust your timing. The less you say, the more room others have to feel what you are. And when your presence is built on depth rather than performance, it leaves an imprint, not because it was loud, but because it was grounded. Epictetus once said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." Quiet power is built on that principle. You decide who you are, and then you live it, not for applause, but for alignment. So if you've ever wondered why some people command attention without asking for it, this is why. They don't chase it, they don't demand it, they simply move in alignment with themselves. And that kind of presence, rooted in inner stillness, always speaks louder than noise. It doesn't need to shout, it simply exists. There's a strange kind of freedom that appears the moment you stop needing care. Not because you've become bitter or numb, but because you've outgrown the illusion that your strength depends on how others treat you. That's the turning point, when the world no longer has the power to shake you. Its silence doesn't unsettle you, its applause doesn't seduce you. You begin to move from a different place, from a center that doesn't ask for permission, doesn't beg to be seen, and doesn't collapse when ignored. That's the paradox. You only gain real power when you stop needing to be rescued, not from pain, but from the discomfort of being alone in your truth. For so long we are taught to believe that care equals safety, that to be heard is to be real, that to be understood is to be valid, that to be held is to be whole. But beneath all of that is a deeper truth. Power is not given by attention or love or recognition. Power is built in silence, brick by brick, through the choices you make when no one is watching. And when you stop craving the emotional resources of others, something remarkable happens. You start becoming your own source. And in that moment, you realize you were never powerless. You were only waiting for permission to be strong. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." That's where this new form of power begins, with acceptance. Acceptance not only of your strengths, but of your fears, your shadows, your disappointments, your unmet needs. You accept that maybe no one will ever fully understand you, that maybe no one will love you exactly the way you hoped, and rather than fighting that reality, you exhale. You stop resisting what is. You stop trying to control how others see or feel about you. And in that surrender, a new kind of control emerges, not over people or outcomes, but over yourself. You stop explaining things that don't need explanation. You stop handing out pieces of your soul in exchange for temporary comfort. You no longer make yourself smaller just to be digestible. You no longer bend your voice just to avoid tension. Instead, you stand in your life unfolded, unedited, and let the chips fall where they may. Some people will fall away, some will draw closer, but none of it defines you anymore. Because now you're the one who defines your worth. You've stopped outsourcing it. You've stopped chasing love as proof of existence. And because of that, you're no longer fragile, you're rooted. This doesn't mean you stop feeling. It doesn't mean you wall yourself off or move through life untouched. It means you stop expecting external care to fix what only internal clarity can. You no longer treat your healing like a group project. You understand now that peace is built alone and maintained by protecting your solitude, not by constantly inviting others in to validate your progress. You no longer need to be mirrored in someone else's eyes to know you're whole. The mirror is now internal, and it doesn't distort. You also stop fearing disconnection because the deepest connection, the one with yourself, has already been established. That's what makes you strong. Not cold, not distant, but self-contained. People can come and go, you can love and be loved, but your foundation doesn't shake with their presence and it doesn't collapse with their withdrawal. That's not detachment from life, it's engagement on your own terms. That's what true autonomy looks like. You stop being a guest in your own mind. You become the architect. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." And when your attention is no longer hooked by who notices you, who cares, who claps, or who stays, you redirect that energy inward, not into isolation but into intention. You start asking different questions, not "why did they treat me that way," but "what can I build with what's left?" You turn pain into discipline, silence into strategy, disappointments into design. You're no longer stuck. You're no longer frozen waiting for the next wave of validation to carry you forward. You've become the current. This kind of power, quiet, grounded, untouchable, doesn't come from good fortune or the right people. It's forged in the moment you stop needing others to meet you and instead meet yourself where you are. And from that meeting, something more honest rises, a self no longer edited to please a direction, no longer shaped by the fear of being misunderstood. A life finally owned, not borrowed from others' expectations. You become someone who moves with clarity, not desperation. Someone who can hold their emotions without spilling them into every interaction. Someone who doesn't crumble when the applause stops because you never built your rhythm around their noise. You don't need to be followed to feel like you're going somewhere. You already know where you're going. And that's why people start to feel your gravity. Not because you demand it, but because you no longer need it. And that's rare. So when you stop needing care, don't mistake that shift for loss. It's not loss, it's a return, a reclaiming, a sharpening. You've taken back the most important thing, the ability to guide yourself, to walk through disappointment without folding, to be unseen without disappearing, to be misunderstood without abandoning yourself. That's where everything changes. That's when life finally starts to move in your favour, not because the world suddenly understands you, but because you've stopped needing it to. And in that space, you become something unshakable, not because you were born that way, but because you chose it again and again, until your mind finally believes you are already enough. You don't need to be seen to become powerful. You don't need to be understood to become whole. The moment you stop waiting for the world to care is the moment you begin to shape yourself into something it cannot ignore, quietly, fully, unapologetically. Thank you for walking this path with me today and for being a part of Stoicism Breath. If this message spoke to you, there's another video on your screen right now that will take you even deeper. Watch it next. Keep building. Keep becoming.